Before we get started, just a quick reminder, the information shared on the Sprout Out Loud podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice. Always consult with your healthcare provider before making changes to your diet or lifestyle. Hey guys, welcome to the third ever episode of the Sprout Out Loud podcast. Thanks again for being here. Today, we are actually getting into something a bit nutrition related. So in my first episode, I shared that I was starting a podcast. Second episode, I talked a little bit more about my background and what brought me to the field of nutrition and my experience with nutrition and exercise. And today, we're going to be talking about a topic that comes up in a lot of my visits. So we're talking about tracking. We're going to be talking about exactly what is tracking. And when I say tracking, I'm talking about tracking food. I'm not talking about tracking exercise or other things like blood sugar. We're going to be talking about who tracking is for, who tracking is not for, which is very important to consider. We'll also talk about the pros, cons, misconceptions around tracking, and how someone might use tracking in their life. Please feel free to fill out the feedback form in my show notes. You can also request a topic for a future episode there. All right, so let's talk about what tracking is. When we talk about tracking food, I am talking about using a tool to bring awareness to our intake. So this could look like tracking with an app like MyFitnessPal or Chronometer or Lose It. We could also track through something like a food journal. We could track through a habit tracker, for example. But why do people track, and how can tracking be a useful tool? So before I move forward, I just want to say that tracking is one of many tools that we can use in our toolkit. There are other tools like tapping into your hunger and fullness cues, building mindful eating habits, so on and so forth. And there are a variety of other ways to encourage balanced, healthy eating patterns and to align yourself with your health goals. Tracking can absolutely be part of someone's journey. It can be a tool that we use at certain points. And for some people, tracking might not be part of their journey at all. So like any tool, it does not need to be exercised all the time. And even the way that we can use this tool will vary from person to person. I also really want to emphasize the fact that intention matters with tracking. We can use tracking, in a way that really supports us and feels positive. But for many people, tracking may be associated with like a negative experience. And my hope is that if anyone pursues tracking after listening to this episode, that you are keeping in mind your intention and that your intention is coming from a very positive place. If you're listening and you're thinking, okay, tracking is just definitely not for me, and I know that, I would encourage you to listen all the way through to the end of the episode, because hopefully this might open your eyes to other ways that we can use this tool to benefit you. So tracking may be helpful for someone who maybe wants to build awareness around their intake. For example, if you're thinking, oh my gosh, I have no idea how much fiber I get, or I have no idea how much protein I get, and I've heard those things are important. Tracking can be helpful for anyone who is goal-oriented. So if you're someone who's training for a particular event and you want to make sure that you're meeting your nutrient needs, like for example, getting in plenty of carbs and plenty of protein to support your physical activity, or if you're managing a certain condition. So for example, if you have type 2 diabetes and you want to do a little bit of carbohydrate counting to support balanced blood sugar levels, tracking can be a short-term awareness building tool for that as well. Tracking can also be helpful for someone who maybe feels empowered and they don't feel like it's a chore, but they feel like it's a tool. And it helps them to move from a place of, again, really making sure that they are eating adequately. Tracking is absolutely not for everyone, and it may not be for someone who has a history of an eating disorder or disordered eating. Tracking, trigger restriction or guilt around food. I will say, in my experience now counseling hundreds of people, I have had a couple of clients share that tracking has actually helped to heal their relationship with food, which I think is a very I don't know, just important to call out. Tracking may not be for someone who feels like really overwhelmed or anxious by it. So if tracking causes decision fatigue or paralysis around our food choices, then it wouldn't really be a helpful tool. If you have all or nothing thinking, tracking may not be for you. I would also argue that tracking may be a good way to challenge that all or nothing thinking, because maybe it forces us to sit in the gray a little bit. And tracking may not be super helpful if you're trying to build intuitive eating skills. If you find that relying on this external information or this external data interferes with your ability to tap into your hunger and fullness cues, for example. I would say that could be true for anyone if you're trying to build intuitive eating skills or not. So again, as a practitioner, tracking is a tool that I use with some of my clients. It's definitely not a tool that I use with everyone. And it is a tool that we might use only in certain phases of their journey. All right, so let's talk about some of the benefits of tracking your food. So first off, tracking can be an amazing awareness building tool. A lot of times with my clients, we'll talk about making sure that we're eating enough of the right nutrients. Let's say, for example, we are talking about a specific protein goal for someone, and we have no idea how much protein they're currently taking in. Well, to meet someone where they are, it can be very, very helpful to track their food for a couple of days to get a better understanding of how much protein they're currently taking in. And then we may take that information and we may compare that to their protein goal and use that data to sort of build these stepwise goals to help them achieve that larger goal. This can also be very, very helpful for understanding where certain nutrients are or are not coming from. My favorite experience is when someone thinks that, oh gosh, I'm so far off from my protein goal, I'm not meeting it, and it feels overwhelming. And then we do a little bit of tracking and they find out, wait, I'm actually much closer than I thought that I was. And that's a liberating feeling, because then we can sort of check that box and we can move on to another area of your nutrition that may benefit from a little bit of more attention. Or we can take that information and we can use that to maybe disperse their protein intake a little bit differently. So for example, maybe someone is meeting their protein needs, but it's not being evenly dispersed throughout the day. And so we can sort of build confidence by saying, hey, you are meeting your needs and we are getting protein from these foods. How could we maybe arrange these foods a little bit differently to disperse your intake? And I'm going to share a client example. So I was recently working with a client and this person was unsure of their protein intake. We did a little bit of tracking, and this tracking showed this person that they were consistently not getting enough protein at lunch. And so one of the other benefits of tracking is that it gives us a very specific roadmap for moving forward. So for example, we knew, okay, lunch is a great intervention point. You're getting plenty of protein at breakfast. We're getting a good bit of protein at dinner. We're missing out on lunch. And so we established a goal of increasing this person's protein at lunch. And after a few days of tracking, we used tracking to support that goal. It was almost a bit of an accountability tool. And we didn't track anything else. We were not tracking calories. We were not tracking carbs, fats, and we were only tracking this specific meal. After a few days of tracking, this person had sort of established this habit. And then they had a couple of days where they were not getting protein in at lunch. And their response was, Allie, I had a couple of days where I didn't get protein at lunch, and I had no idea how much that was affecting me until I stopped getting that intake in. And so this person realized that when they don't get enough protein at lunch, they end up overeating at dinner, and they end up making choices that they don't necessarily feel very good about because their hunger tends to build up so much early in the day. And for this person, tracking actually helped to actually improve their relationship with food, because it empowered them to get more of that protein in at lunch, which led them to show up at dinner with a more manageable level of appetite, which led them to make more empowered choices at dinner and thereafter. So this is just one example of how tracking can be a short-term tool. And so now we've established this habit of getting in enough protein at lunch for this person. and we're no longer tracking. Tracking is wonderful for supporting a specific goal, right? So let's say you're someone who has polycystic ovary syndrome. And in this condition, we know that one thing that's really, really important is making sure that we're getting plenty of fiber in. So we can use tracking to see how much fiber you're currently taking in. And if we wanted to increase your fiber intake, that's something that we would want to do slowly so that we're not putting you at risk for GI discomfort, right? So if we increase your fiber intake too quickly, you may then experience gas, bloating, abdominal pain, constipation, diarrhea. And oftentimes, this may lead someone to just sort of go back to what they were doing previously. And that doesn't really support those long-term changes. So if we get a better understanding of your current fiber intake, similar to protein, we can establish like a stepwise goal to increase your fiber intake over a longer period of time. Tracking can also be very helpful for identifying patterns in your intake. So for a lot of people, Monday through Friday, maybe we have a little bit more structure in our routine. Maybe we're eating at regular meal times. And then even if the actual foods we're choosing are the same on the weekends, we may be eating differently on those days. So maybe we are having later meals, maybe we're having larger meals, and maybe those things are preventing a little bit of consistency throughout the entire week. And again, tracking by understanding those patterns provides us a very good intervention point, and it allows us to establish small, specific, and doable goals so that we eliminate frustration in your life and we make it easier for you to meet those goals. It is also going to be really, really helpful for, again, identifying connections between our intake and how we feel. So for example, let's say someone is following regular meal patterns throughout the week. On weekends, they're skipping breakfast. Through tracking, we're sort of able to identify, okay, I'm consistently low energy in the afternoons on the days that I skip breakfast. And I'm able to identify that because tracking provided a pattern or a trend for me to see. And then potentially one of my favorite benefits of tracking is that it really helps with meal planning and grocery shopping. So when we track our intake and we see how much food we're getting or how much food we need, that can be really supportive of helping to build a grocery list that just aligns with your nutrient needs. So if you're consistently maybe underbuying groceries or overbuying groceries, getting a rough estimate of how much you need, whether by calculating your energy needs or by just tracking and seeing what your trends are, that provides us, again, a clear roadmap for building a grocery list, maybe writing out a very rough meal plan so that we can estimate how much food you actually need, which helps with the more practical things of buying groceries. Throughout all of this, tracking should be used in a way that helps you figure out what works best for you. So again, with this person who realized not getting enough protein at lunch really affected them, tracking can also help you tweak your nutrition and figure out, okay, I feel really good on this day, and what was happening with my intake. Or I did not feel good on this day. What was happening with my intake. Of course, other things like sleep and stress and physical activity may play into that. But I think in a world where we have so much information about nutrition, tracking can sort of provide data that helps you cut through the noise of social media and really figure out what works for you. So some really specific examples. For someone who says, I'm eating healthy, but I'm not seeing results. Tracking can, again, provide us a clear picture of your patterns and maybe tweak a couple of things to reduce that frustration. Tracking can also be helpful for identifying things like digestive issues or maybe even food sensitivities. So if we notice, okay, I just tracked, and again, this does not have to be through an app. This could be through a food journal. And that may help us to identify patterns between abdominal bloating or other GI symptoms like constipation, diarrhea, and linking those symptoms with specific foods or patterns, right? Even something like when I eat really fast, I have these symptoms. And so maybe it's not about the food. Maybe it's about the way that I'm eating the food. Tracking can be super helpful for bringing awareness to meals that might not be super balanced. So maybe, again, we're getting the right mix of nutrients by the end of the day. But if those nutrients could be dispersed in a way at each meal that supports better blood sugar control. Tracking can be insightful for telling us how you're building your meals. If you're someone who struggles with overeating at night or on the weekends, if we take a look at your intake, we might see, okay, you're underfueling at this part of the day or underfueling at this part of the week. How could we intervene here to address the root cause of this overeating? Okay, moving on to some of the cons or negative aspects of tracking. If we have a specific calorie goal, for example, and we are using tracking to stay within that goal, whether that goal is something that someone has assigned us or we've just assigned ourselves because we feel as though we should be eating a certain number of calories. For example, I see a lot of I know I should be eating 1,200 calories or 1,500 calories. And a lot of times people are coming up with these numbers based on what they see on social media or blogs or what have you. Anyways, if we are using tracking in this way to really stay within a certain limit, then tracking can really take us away from our hunger and fullness cues. So this could look like not eating enough because we actually are hungry, but our tracker says that we have met our calorie goal or any other macronutrient goal for the day. This could also look like overeating. So let's say that you're not physically hungry and we've met your nutrient needs, your building balanced meals, and you're sort of force feeding yourself. This is where tracking can sort of take away from that. And so again, this is not the same as using tracking as an awareness building tool where we're just sort of seeing where you're at. This is almost like having a budget that doesn't fit your lifestyle versus making a budget based on how you're spending. And making that budget livable for you, if that makes sense. Second thing is tracking, depending on how we're using it, it can be really time consuming and really mentally cumbersome. And so if we're using tracking, again, to be really meticulous, we're logging every single thing, we're really shooting for this A+ perfectionist approach to tracking, well then, of course, that's going to burn us out. We're going to be exhausted. We're going to not want to think about food. We're going to not even want to eat because we're like, oh God, then I got to track it. And this is not an approach that I ever really recommend. I think if we wanted to do that for one day to get a very detailed picture of your micronutrient intake, awesome. But that level of tracking is not sustainable in my, professional and personal opinion. That only should be exercised if you have a very short time frame around that, if you have a very specific goal, and if you're working with someone who has a very, very healthy and stable relationship with food. That is not something that should ever be used with someone who does not have the best relationship with food. And I hope that goes without saying. So for some people, tracking could also lead to maybe focusing more on numbers and less on food quality. So we see this a lot with macro tracking or calorie tracking, where again, maybe if we have a specific weight loss goal, we're just staying within that calorie limit, but not really focusing on food quality. That may lead us to not really feeling great. Maybe that doesn't support long-term and sustainable changes that benefit our health. And then there's definitely a learning curve with tracking, depending on the method. For some people, tracking may or may not involve a food scale. I actually think a food scale is a super helpful tool, again, depending on how we use that. And for some people, tracking is really going to just get in our heads and make us almost overthink our nutrition or overthink our choices. And so with these people, we might really reframe, how are we even using this tool? What is the objective here? But again, using an app is just one way to track. We could use a food journal and we could just, use that as a means to take a look at our trends and patterns. Another comparison I wanted to make was as far as the hunger and fullness cues go, it's sort of similar to a Whoop, where maybe we're feeling really good. We're like, all right, I really want to work out today, but our Whoop is hey, you're based on your recent performance and your sleep, today's a really bad day for you to work out. We want to use these tools as something that serves us and not something that rules us. I don't use a Whoop, but if I did, if I was feeling really good and my Whoop told me it wasn't a good day to work out, I would probably still work out. Same thing if I was really not feeling good and my Whoop was like, yeah, you should get after it today. I'm going to listen to my body instead. Okay, now what are some misconceptions around tracking? I've indirectly addressed these things so far, but first misconception is that you need to track everything. No, you absolutely do not need to track everything. It really just depends on your goal for tracking and how you're using it and the information that you are trying to obtain. Number 2 is that you need to track all of the time. No, you also do not need to track all of the time. For some people, maybe it makes sense to track 7 days, again, depending on what their goal is and their relationship with food. But oftentimes we could even use 2 weekdays and 1 weekend day as a sample for the whole week if we're looking for like an overall picture. Misconception number 3 is that you need to track perfectly. Again, this is going to depend on your specific goals, but even partial tracking can really provide some meaningful results, and it can just make it a little bit more accessible. So this is where we might focus on like B- tracking versus A+ tracking. A perfect example of this is when someone is going out to eat. Let's say that they're tracking 2 weekdays, 1 weekend day, and they're dining out. We would want for this exercise to be livable for you. Like by no means should you be at the restaurant asking the server the calorie information. I don't know. I just feel like that's not livable unless if that's how you'd like to go about it, by all means, more power to you. But sometimes people will say, oh, well, I couldn't find, let's say I was using an app and going that route. I couldn't find that food on the app, so I just didn't track it. Well, not tracking something is still going to be a lot less accurate than if we were to track a similar item, right? So omitting something completely is going to be the most inaccurate. And so finding something similar is still going to provide us a picture, and it can tell us information about your trends, so on and so forth. Another misconception is that you need to have a macronutrient goal or a calorie goal in order to track. Again, no, this really just depends on how you're using this tool. You also do not need to have a food scale in order to track. I really think that using a food scale is actually one of the best ways to reduce frustration around tracking because it's going to be much more accurate than measuring cups and spoons. But we absolutely don't need to use a food scale. We can use other measures, for example, a palm-sized serving of protein might be anywhere between 3 to 5 ounces. Again, just depends on how granular we would like to get. And then last misconception is that you need to use an app like MyFitnessPal or Lose It or Chronometer to track. No, again, depending on the goal, pen and paper is totally fine. Keeping a food journal is totally fine. Even using a habit tracker. So for example, let's say I wanted to just get in the habit of having a piece of fruit with my lunch every single day. I could use a habit tracker as a means of tracking that habit. That's pretty redundant. Okay. Now, there are also some inherent flaws with tracking. So one example would be weighing cooked food and then logging it as uncooked. That's going to either underestimate or overestimate the nutrients in that food. Another thing to consider is even just nutrition facts labels. There's a 20% margin of error on nutrition facts labels. So this means that, let's say something is listed as having 100 calories, it could actually have anywhere between 80 to 120 calories. So there is that margin of error there. And then lastly, if we are using tracking as a means to meet a specific calorie goal, tracking really doesn't consider more of these nuanced things like how many nutrients or how much energy or calories that we extract from food based on things like our gut bacteria or even our lean body mass. Now, that's really nuanced. That's not something that most people need to worry about. This is just sharing that this isn't a perfect measure. And so I don't want to say that we shouldn't take it all that seriously, but even if you're being as meticulous as you could be, there's still going to be some slight nuances. And so that is an invitation to not be meticulous or not be overly meticulous for an extended period of time. Now, with this, even if tracking is inaccurate, if it is consistently inaccurate, then that information is still very valuable to us, right? So if we have a thermometer in our house and that thermometer is off by 3 degrees, even if it is off by 3 degrees, that thermometer will tell us if the temperature in our house is increasing or decreasing. So even though tracking is inaccurate, if we're using the same method, it's going to be consistently inaccurate, and that can provide meaningful information for us to use to help ourselves. Okay, now we're going to talk about tips, tricks, and ways to use tracking in a way that it serves you. So again, tracking is not for everyone. If you do not have a healthy relationship with food at this time, if you have a history of disordered eating or eating disorders, if you become overly granular with this information, if you're really not able to separate yourself from this information, then it may not be the best time for you to track. Some may argue that tracking actually is a good strategy to challenge these beliefs. It can be a bit of exposure therapy, if you will. But this is where, if you do go this route, it can be very helpful to work with someone, whether it's a dietitian or even a nutritionist or a health coach, really someone who's going to sort of be your tracking doula or tracking guide, someone who's going to be there to remind you, hey, this is why we're doing this. This is the plan that we had laid out, and let's stay the course. So let's not get too granular if the goal is to just provide, a broad picture of your overall intake or just to support a very, very specific goal. So some ways, again, that you might want to use tracking is if you find that tracking could maybe help you meet a specific goal, right? So maybe you have a goal for protein, maybe you have a goal for fiber, maybe you have a goal for carbohydrates. If you are someone who's very physically active or if you want to increase your performance in the gym, maybe you want to use tracking to sort of uncover patterns or root causes of symptoms like cravings or overeating or digestive issues, or just kind of figure out like, why am I not making progress on this specific area? And how can tracking actually provide data that would reduce the frustrations around this versus adding more frustration around this? So some questions to ask yourself to see if tracking might be right for you. Do I feel curious about my habits, or do I feel critical and judgmental? If I feel critical and judgmental, is tracking really going to be helpful? Maybe it will. Maybe it'll actually tell you you're doing a better job than you think. Next question, am I able to view data about my intake neutrally, or does it trigger guilt, shame, or obsession? Will tracking feel like a helpful tool, or will it feel like another thing that I need to be quote unquote perfect at? I love this one. Will tracking help me build skills or insight that I can eventually apply without needing to track long term? I feel like this is the case with everyone I work with. Again, it's just a short-term tool. It supports that habit formation. Once those habits are formed, we don't continue tracking. Am I in a place emotionally and mentally where I can approach tracking with flexibility? Again, for some people, tracking may be helpful, but it may not be the right time. And this is where working with someone to sort of support you in this process could make all of the difference. Last question. Well, there are plenty others, but another one to consider. Do I tend to fixate on numbers in ways that take me further from trusting my body? I said earlier that tracking may be at odds with intuitive eating. It may be, depending on how we use it. But I do think that there are misconceptions around intuitive eating where some people may think that intuitive eating means that I eat what I want when I want, and it stops there. Intuitive eating is actually using what you want and combining that with what you know that your body needs. And so tracking can actually help to build awareness around what your body needs by maybe helping you see how you feel when you meet your nutrient needs in a way that actually makes intuitive eating much, much more helpful. And so one example of this is that, let's say I really want a bagel, okay? It's the morning, I really want a bagel for breakfast. What people think intuitive eating is, and maybe not everyone, but this is a misconception around this topic, is that, all right, I want a bagel, therefore I'm just gonna have a bagel and that's it. Well, intuitive eating could actually look like, I want a bagel for breakfast, but I know that I don't feel satisfied for very long and I end up feeling hungry really shortly after eating if my meal doesn't have enough protein or fiber. And so I'm gonna have the bagel, but I'm going to add a source of protein and a source of fiber to that. For example, maybe it's a couple of eggs and a side of veggies, or even a side of like berries or fruit to get that fiber in. And so I'm gonna add these foods so that I have what I want, aka the bagel, and I'm gonna give my body what it needs so that I have a positive experience of not feeling hungry after eating. Intuitive eating could also look like, I want a bagel and I know that I would feel more satisfied and satiated for longer if I added protein and fiber to that. But adding those foods is actually going to take away from my enjoyment of that bagel, and I'm going to move forward with this choice knowing that I will be hungry shortly after. And The difference between that example of moving forward with just the bagel without the added protein and fiber versus just, oh, I want a bagel and that's what I want, therefore that's what I'm going to have. The difference is that we have an awareness of what our body needs, right? And we are choosing to or to not leverage that awareness. Okay, so that was a little bit of a detour on intuitive eating, but I just felt like it could sort of tie into this topic. Okay, so in summary, tracking is a tool that we can use in our toolkit to help us achieve our nutrition-related goals. There are different forms of tracking. We could track with an app. We could track with a food log. We could use a habit tracker. There are certain pros and cons of tracking. Tracking is absolutely not meant for everyone. Depending on your history and relationship with food and where you are at currently, tracking may or may not be right for you. Tracking can be used at different points in someone's nutrition journey. Tracking can be used very short term. And it can support that overall habit formation, which would actually lend to not tracking thereafter. There are some inherent flaws with tracking, and it can be helpful to ask yourself some of these questions before we start tracking. All right. If you have feedback on this episode, if you'd like for me to dive into a specific area of this episode that I mentioned, please feel free to fill out the feedback and topic request form that's in the show notes. And that's it. I will see you guys next week. Thanks again for listening.